Just a nurse playing hero. That's what Dr. Sterling called her in front of the Colonel's family. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply adjusted the foredrip and continued monitoring the heart monitor's steady pulse, her hands moving with a kind of precision that comes from 16 years of muscle memory she no longer uses. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, casting everything in that particular shade of hospital white that made blood look black and exhaustion look like wisdom. Sacred Heart's ICU in Norfolk smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee and something underneath both, the copper scent of people who'd been through things. Margaret knew that smell in her bones. She'd been working the night shift for 3 years. 3 years of being invisible. 3 years of quiet competence mistaken for timidity by everyone who mattered, which is to say, everyone except the patients. The patients always knew. The fluorescent bulb above bed flickered. Once. Twice. Margaret made a mental note to report it. Infections loved the shadows cast by failing lights. She'd learned that in places where the generators ran on diesel fuel and prayers, where the heat climbed to 127 degrees and the nearest surgical theater was 40 kilometers away through terrain that wanted you dead. But that was another lifetime. This was Sacred Heart. This was Norfolk. This was the place she'd chosen to disappear. Colonel James Hendricks came in at 22:13 on a Thursday night in May. Trauma alert. 5 gunshot wounds from a firefight in Marja. The alert system shrieked through the hospital's overhead speakers like a wounded animal, and the night shift staff moved in that controlled chaos that looks like panic to civilians but feels like choreography to people who've trained for moments like this. 2 paramedics wheeled the stretcher, calling vitals in that rapid-fire paramedic cadence, BP 94/62, heart rate 138, respiratory distress, while the ER attending barked orders and the surgical team assembled like a machine recognizing its own parts. Margaret recognized him immediately. Not from the news. Not from military databases or photographs. She recognized him the way you recognize someone you've seen through 1,000 FaceTime calls on a young man's phone, in uniform, laughing at jokes she wasn't supposed to understand. Her son David had talked about Colonel Hendricks the way soldiers talk about the ones who save your life. The ones you'd follow into hell. She said nothing. Not a word. She simply moved into position as the trauma team brought him into the ICU, his flight suit torn open to reveal the entry wounds. 1 in the left shoulder, 2 across the ribs, 1 low in the abdomen, 1 that had caught the edge of his pelvis. He was conscious. That was either excellent news or the worst kind of sign. Margaret had seen enough trauma to know the difference between being awake and being alive. Core temp 36.1, dropping, she said quietly to the resident standing across from her. Her hands were already moving, steadying the 4 lines, adjusting the oxygen feed. The resident, a thin man named Patterson who'd been at Sacred Heart for 3 months, glanced at her with that expression they all got when Margaret said something competent. Surprise. As if she'd spoken in a language they didn't expect her to know. Good catch, he said, and turned away to check the trauma panel. The colonel's family arrived at 23:06. A woman who had to be his wife, her blonde hair pulled back so tight it made her face look sculptured. 2 adult sons in military dress uniforms. The younger one had David's eyes. Margaret kept her gaze on the monitors and away from that family, but she felt their shock at seeing him split open on a hospital bed like a question no one wanted answered. The monitors beat their slow electronic rhythm. Oxygen saturation holding at 94. Heart rate elevated but stable. Blood pressure still too low. The trauma surgeon, a compact woman named Dr. Chen, was already calling for blood products and imaging, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who'd seen worse and lived to operate another day. Margaret had worked under combat surgeons in field hospitals where the electricity came from generators and the surgical lights were powered by prayer and caffeine. She recognized competence when she heard it. But Dr. Sterling showed up at 23:41. He arrived the way he always did, as if the ICU had been waiting for him, as if his presence was the thing that would transform chaos into order. He was tall enough to make the room feel smaller, with the kind of face that photographs well and the kind of manner that made nurses step back without being asked. He wore a watch that cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. The first thing he did was check the insurance coverage. Margaret watched him do it while the colonel's wife was still crying into her oldest son's shoulder. "Where are the CT results?" Sterling demanded. "Being processed," Dr. Chen said without looking up from the wound assessment. 17 minutes. Not fast enough. Sterling's voice had that particular edge that came from never being told no. "I want them in 12. Call the radiologist directly. Tell him I'm asking." Margaret continued adjusting the fluid rate, watching the 4-bag empty drop by drop into the line that led to the colonel's arm. His oxygen saturation had dipped to 91. Not critical. Not yet. But trending the wrong direction. She increased the oxygen flow and made a note on the chart. Dr. Chen glanced at it and nodded. The smallest acknowledgement. Margaret had learned to read those nods like they were medals. That was when Dr. Sterling noticed her. "Why are you adjusting the oxygen without order?" His voice filled the ICU like someone had turned up the volume on everything. The family stopped crying. The monitors seemed to beep louder. "We have protocols, nurse. This patient is a military officer with serious injuries. The last thing he needs is a nurse thinking she knows better than the surgical team." Margaret turned to face him. She didn't hurry. She didn't fumble. She simply turned, kept her hand steady, and met his eyes with the kind of composure that comes from having already survived worse than a surgeon's anger. His O2 sat was dropping, she said quietly. 91 and trending down. The adjustment was indicated. The adjustment was your assumption. Sterling's jaw tightened. "Check with me next time. Or step aside and let the actual physicians handle this." He didn't say it quietly. He said it the way people say things when they want an audience. The family heard it. The residents heard it. The nurses at the desk heard it. Margaret had learned something in 3 years of night shifts. Being invisible meant people forgot you could hear. She didn't argue. She didn't defend. She simply returned to monitoring the lines, keeping her attention on the numbers that mattered. Dr. Chen was watching Sterling with an expression that suggested she'd like to commit violence, but she also didn't say anything. The unspoken rule of hospitals: never challenge the hierarchy where the family could hear. The colonel's wife was looking at Margaret now. Not at Sterling. At her. Trying to understand why the quiet nurse in the blue scrubs had just absorbed a public rebuke without flinching. Margaret monitored the vitals. 92, 93. Holding. She didn't look back. But later, when the night settled into that particular kind of quiet that only exists in ICU wings at 3 in the morning, Margaret went to her locker and opened it with shaking hands that had nothing to do with fear. She kept the boots at the very bottom, beneath the extra scrubs and the emergency granola bars and the photograph of David in his marine dress blues. They were tan leather, broken in along the creases, scarred from desert sand and concrete and 1,000 kilometers of terrain that had belonged to her in another life. The name stamped inside was still visible, faded but readable. M. Walsh. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. 16 years of field hospitals and C-130 flights and watching young men's eyes go from alive to something else. 16 years of hands that knew how to stop bleeding and save lives and hold people together as they fell apart. 16 years of PTSD that made those hands shake so badly she couldn't hold a scalpel anymore, so she'd walked away. Just disappeared. Changed her name to the thing no one said out loud. Just a nurse. She held the boots for exactly 4 seconds, then put them back. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarmed and went silent again. Margaret closed her locker and went back to the ICU, where the colonel was still fighting for his life and nobody knew that the woman checking his lines had once held 47 Marines' lives in hands that now trembled with things no one talked about. The fluorescent lights of the ICU cast a sallow glow across Margaret's face as she adjusted the kernels for drip, her movements precise and economical. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, good oxygen saturation now, BP stabilizing, the kind of incremental progress that meant the man might actually survive this. She had caught the dip in his O2 at 88% when Drive Sterling had still been reviewing the patient's insurance documentation in the corner, squinting at a screen like it might bite him. She had simply repositioned the kernel, adjusted the ventilator settings by 2%, and the numbers had climbed back to 94. A small thing. Invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to see it. That was her mistake. Dr. Sterling had emerged from his paperwork corner just in time to watch her step back from the bedside, and something in his face had changed. A kind of electrical tension. The colonel's family stood in the corner, his ex-wife and their adult son David, who wore the dress blues of a Marine captain, and Sterling had used them like an audience. He moved toward Margaret with the kind of precision that said he had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Did I authorize a ventilator adjustment?" His voice was not loud. That was what made it work. Quiet people listened harder. Margaret met his eyes without flinching. His saturation was dropping. "I corrected it." "You corrected it." Sterling turned to the family as if translating something foreign. "The colonel has a team of physicians. Multiple specialists. A respiratory therapist on call. And this nurse," he gestured at Margaret with 2 fingers, "decided she knew better. Decided the protocols didn't apply to her." David shifted forward, his hand instinctively moving. Margaret caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not now. Not here." Sterling continued, his voice still that dangerous quiet. "You know what we call this? Overstepping. Insubordination. The kind of behavior that gets people hurt." He paused, letting it land. "Or worse." Margaret said nothing. The silence was complete. Even the monitors seemed to quiet. "She used to be a good nurse," Sterling said to the family, as if Margaret had already left the room. Before the hand started shaking. Before she started making decisions she wasn't qualified to make. Before she became more interested in being a hero than following orders. He pulled a document from his pocket, already prepared, already printed. "I'm posting a formal complaint on the unit board. All staff should know that Senior Nurse Walsh is on notice for violating standard cardiac care protocols and questioning physician authority." He had said it deliberately. Margaret understood. Not Margaret. Senior nurse. The military rank structure he didn't know about, used as an insult. An old title. A has-been title. David took a step forward. His mother, the colonel's ex-wife, put a hand on his arm and whispered something. Whatever she said made him stand down, but his jaw had gone tight. Margaret felt the weight of his anger like a physical thing, and beneath it, the older weight of recognition. He knew she was something other than what Sterling was describing. He didn't know exactly what, but he knew. Sterling taped the complaint to the unit board at the nursing station in front of everyone, the night shift skeleton crew, the 2 residents passing through, the patient care tech restocking supplies. His movements were theatrical. He wanted witnesses. Margaret returned to her charting station without reacting, though she could feel the glances sliding toward her like oil across water. The message had been delivered. Dr. Sterling was a man with institutional authority and a long institutional memory, and he had decided to spend both of them on making her small. The break room at 0238 hours was usually her sanctuary. The old vinyl chairs, the flickering fluorescent tubes, the coffee that tasted like burned plastic. Solitude. She had made herself tea and was sitting at the corner table when Nurse Patterson came in, saw her, and visibly reconsidered. Patterson had been at Sacred Heart for 9 years. They had worked 40 shifts together. Patterson had borrowed Margaret's stethoscope twice. "Hey," Margaret said quietly. Patterson looked away and collected her lunch from the refrigerator without speaking. She took it out of the break room. 30 seconds later, 2 more nurses came in, grabbed their things, and left without sitting down. The message rippled through the night shift like wind through water. By 03:11 hours, Margaret sat alone at the table with her tea going cold. No one else entered the break room while she was there. She counted 14 intervals where staff passed by the open door, saw her, and found reasons to be elsewhere. Isolation was a form of violence too. She had learned that in field hospitals. When the group turned, the individual was already dead, just a matter of time and biology catching up. Sterling found her at the medication cart near the colonel's room, and she knew it was intentional. He had been waiting for privacy, for the moment when she was vulnerable. His voice was conversational now, which was worse than the quiet fury had been. "You know what your problem is." He didn't wait for an answer. "You think you're smarter than you are. You think one good catch makes you a diagnostician. You think this place needs you." He smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. "You're a has-been nurse playing hero. Trying to prove something to yourself because you know everyone here knows the truth. You're washed up. You couldn't cut it doing the real work, so you hide in the ICU where sick people can't tell good nursing from desperate." Margaret took one measured breath. The kind of breath she had been trained to take. In through the nose, hold for 4, out through the mouth. It was the breath before action. The breath before anything changed. "Colonel Hendricks is still alive," Margaret said, her voice level as water, "because I recognized cardiac tamponade while you were reviewing his insurance coverage." Sterling's face went very still. That was the moment she understood he had believed his own narrative. He had told himself she was a broken thing, and she had just reminded him that broken things still cut. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Then he turned and walked away, his pace sharp enough to suggest he had somewhere important to be. By morning, the whisper campaign had expanded. Dr. Sterling had called 3 of her previous employers, references she had listed on her hire paperwork 5 years ago, asking pointed questions about her stability and her tendency to overstep professional boundaries. One of them was a nurse manager from Seattle General, where Margaret had worked before Norfolk, before she needed to disappear. That woman had said something to someone who knew someone in the hospital administration, and that someone had decided that questions had been raised and investigations needed to happen. Margaret learned about it when her shift supervisor, Nurse Caldwell, called her into her office at 1500 hours. No invitation for tea. No pretense of anything but official business. "There's been a formal complaint filed," Caldwell said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Multiple complaints, actually. We're going to need to open an inquiry into your patient care practices and your adherence to hospital protocol." Margaret sat very still. The office was small and smelled like old carpet and artificial vanilla, someone's desperate attempt to make institutional space feel human. "I was doing my job," Margaret said. "That's under review." Caldwell's fingers were nervous on her desk, tapping some unheard rhythm. "Until the investigation concludes, we're going to need to pull you from the ICU rotation. You'll be reassigned to the 4th floor, medical surgical. Lighter workload. Supervisor oversight. Medical surgical. The exile ward. Where nurses went when they had already been judged." "Understood," Margaret said, and left before Caldwell could find any more words. By evening, the entire hospital staff knew. The quiet nurse had been investigated. The story that circulated was that she had falsified vitals, that she had made unauthorized medication changes, that she had been insubordinate to Dr. Sterling. The actual facts were less important than the shape of the narrative, the nurse on her way out, a career collapsing, the natural order of hierarchy asserting itself. Margaret checked the colonel's status one more time before she left for the night. His oxygen saturation was holding at 96%. His cardiac rhythm was sinus and stable. His blood pressure was climbing back toward normal. He was going to live because she had caught the problem in those first minutes, because her hands had moved with certainty, because she had recognized the signs. She walked out of Sacred Heart at 2,247 hours and sat in her car for exactly 9 minutes without turning the engine on. The parking lot was empty except for her, the vast dark concrete reflecting the sodium lights overhead. She could have called someone. David. Her ex-husband. The VA clinic that kept sending her appointment reminders she never opened. Instead, she drove home to her small apartment on the edge of Norfolk and retrieved the pair of combat boots from the back of her bedroom closet. They were worn at the heels, cracked along the sides, the leather the color of old blood. She had carried them through 100 moves, this last piece of the woman she had been. She sat on her bed and held them in her lap like they might tell her what to do next. They didn't. They were just boots. Just objects. Just the last physical evidence that Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had ever existed at all. Tomorrow she would report to the 4th floor, where they had already decided who she was and what she was worth. The monitor flatlined at 0206 hours. Not a gradual decline. Not a gentle slip into arrhythmia. A vertical line. A scream. The kind of sound that belongs in nightmares, not in the careful quiet of an ICU at 2 in the morning when most of Norfolk slept and the world felt like it held its breath. Colonel Hendrick's chest filled with blood. Margaret saw it the way a sniper sees a target, not with panic, but with absolute clarity. The oxygen saturation dropped like a stone. 88. 84. 79. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into lungs that couldn't use it because fluid was drowning everything inside. Dr. Sterling stood frozen at the ultrasound machine. His hands moved wrong. Trembling. Searching. The probe wavered across the colonel's chest like he was reading Braille in the dark. 23 years of cardiac surgery and he was looking for a cardiac tamponade like a man trying to find his car keys in an empty parking lot. The monitor kept screaming. 71. 68. 64. Get the crash cart, Sterling called out, his voice cracking at the edges. Someone call respiratory. The room dissolved into the chaos of incompetence. A resident fumbled with medications. A nursing assistant knocked over and forced stand. The respiratory therapist checked the ventilator settings for the 3rd time like the machine might suddenly start working if she stared hard enough. Margaret moved. Not fast. Not panicked. She moved the way muscle memory moves, the way hands that have held dying Marines in Fallujah move when there is no time for hesitation. She was already opening the crash cart, already gathering the equipment. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Sterile field. 1.5% chlorhexidine for the skin prep. Her hand steady as surgical lasers. Step back, doctor, she said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Sterling whirled around. Excuse me, I am the attending. Chest cavity full. Negative ultrasound findings because you're looking in the wrong axis. She was already positioning the colonel, turning him 15 degrees onto his left side. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The blood is compressing the right atrium. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz. She prepped the site. 60 seconds. The needle went in, smooth, practiced, the kind of insertion that comes from doing it 43 times under fire when the only anesthesia available was adrenaline and necessity. The hiss of air escaping. The sudden rush of dark blood into the syringe. 100 cc. 150 cc. 200 cc. The monitor changed its song. A blip. Then another. Sinus rhythm climbing. 60 beats. 65. 70. 75. 80. 82. 85. 90. 92. Stable. The colonel's blood pressure climbed from 62/40 to 98/64 in the span of 11 seconds. His oxygen saturation crawled upward like a mountain climber reaching for air that actually existed. Sterling stared at the monitor, then at Margaret, then at the 200 cc of blood in the syringe that had been drowning his patient from the inside out while he fumbled with an ultrasound probe like a man defusing a bomb with oven mitts on. How did you, he started. But Margaret wasn't listening anymore. She was back in Marja. 2009, the blast had come through the east wall of the clinic, and there were pieces of 2 Marines on the operating table and a 3rd Marine with a sucking chest wound and no one available but her because the only surgeon was already elbow-deep in a 3rd casualty. She could smell the cordite. Could see the desert sand on everyone's boots mixing with blood on the tile floor. Could feel the weight of the moment, that single decision point where someone lives or someone dies and you are the only one standing between those 2 outcomes. The flashback hit like a bullet. For a moment, just a moment, she wasn't in Norfolk. She was in a field hospital with mortar rounds falling and her hands performing a procedure she'd learned in medical school but perfected under fire because there was no choice. No time. No backup. No room for doubt. When the present snapped back, the ICU looked exactly the same and completely different. The colonel was stable. Breathing. The monitor was beeping with the rhythm of a man who would wake up and live because someone remembered what her hands had been trained to do. That's when the doors exploded open. 2 gunmen. No uniforms. No identifiable insignia. Just men with intent carved into their faces and weapons raised like they'd done this before. The first one had a 9mm. The second carried something larger, a Glock maybe, military issue, and in the fractional second before the world accelerated into chaos, Margaret recognized the bearing. Military training. Someone who knew how to move through rooms like a predator hunting wounded prey. Where is he? The first gunman's voice was flat. Professional. Hendricks. Now. The ICU dissolved into screaming. A nursing assistant ran for the code button. Someone dropped a monitor with a crash like a dropped anvil. Dr. Sterling backed toward the wall with his hands up, his face the color of surrender. A resident froze in the doorway, caught between fleeing and staying, choosing poorly and doing neither. Margaret stepped in front of the colonel's bed. Not thinking. Not calculating. Just moving into the space between the patient and the threat, the way a mother steps between a car and her child, the way a soldier steps between an attack and the people she's sworn to protect. Her body was suddenly between 140 rounds of ammunition and 180 pounds of unconscious Air Force colonel. You need to step aside, the second gunman said, and there was almost apology in his voice, the way someone apologizes before they do something permanent. The first gunman had already squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit like a hammer swung by a heavyweight champion. Not the way movies showed it, no neat hole, no dramatic pause. It was a collision. A violent rewriting of biology. The round passed through her left shoulder with the kind of physics that doesn't care about medical licenses or quiet integrity. The pain was information. Pain is data. Through and through wound, anterior shoulder, probable subclavicular artery nicked because blood was pouring the way blood pours from arterial wounds. She could feel the numbness spreading down her arm, nerve damage, temporary hopefully, permanent maybe. She didn't move. The second gunman raised the Glock, and Margaret understood she was about to take a second round. She understood that 2-round center mass would end this particular story very quickly. But security tackled the second gunman 6 inches into his firing arc, and the round went wide and high, grazing past her ribs with heat like a brand, cutting a line of fire along her left side that burned the way burns burn when the fire is traveling faster than pain receptors can report. Her blood pooled on the linoleum. Dark. Spreading. The metallic smell of it, copper and iron and the specific signature of hemorrhage, filled the ICU like a presence. Margaret's right hand never let go of the colonel's bed rail. Her left arm hung useless, blood dripping from her fingertips at a rhythm matching her heartbeat. One drop. Another. A small red constellation appearing on the white floor. She could feel the adrenaline, could feel her pupils dilating, could feel her breathing shift into the pattern she'd learned in a field hospital 17 years ago when staying conscious was a choice and staying functional was survival. The gunman struggled against security. The second gunman was already detained, zip-tied, radio chatter crackling with law enforcement en route, and Dr. Sterling was staring at Margaret with the expression of a man who had just watched a quiet ICU nurse take 2 rounds for a patient and not fall down. That was the moment Sterling's phone rang. His network was already activated. His institutional power was already mobilizing. By the time the Norfolk PD had secured the room and the fire department was arriving with paramedics and the hospital operator was announcing a code silver, Sterling was already on the phone with the hospital board. "She's compromised," Margaret heard him say as the paramedics worked on her shoulder. "Mentally unstable. Definitely unstable. You heard her, talking about field triage protocols. She was performing emergency procedures without authorization. And now she's claiming she knew these gunmen somehow. This is a security liability. 72 hours later, she would be suspended. The gunmen came through the doors like they owned the place. Booth 3. ICU main entrance. 0206 hours. Margaret saw them before anyone else did. The way they moved, shoulders squared, hands ready, eyes hunting. Not hospital staff. Not security. Professionals. The colonel's eyes locked onto hers for half a second. A question. A plea. She stepped in front of his bed. Not between the shooters and the colonel. In front of them. Her body. Her scrubs. Her decision made in the space of one breath. The first bullet entered through her left shoulder, tearing through muscle and shattering bone like porcelain. The second grazed her ribs, burning a line of fire across her abdomen. Pain was immediate. Specific. A message her nervous system sent in screaming detail. Her hands never left the bed rail. "Get down," she said. "Quiet." The voice of someone who had said it before in worse places. Security hit the ICU entrance like a tactical squad, because this was Norfolk, because the Pentagon had already started asking questions about who was trying to kill an Air Force colonel in a civilian hospital, because somewhere in the chain of command someone had decided this mattered enough to position people in the halls. The gunman went down hard. Tackled. Cuffed. One of them bit an officer and bled onto the white tile floor. But Margaret's blood was already there first, spreading in a dark pool beneath her feet, pooling around her shoes, staining the linoleum the color of old pennies. She did not let go of the bed rail. A nurse, Thompson from the night shift, was already on her with trauma shears, cutting through the scrubs. Margaret's shoulder was a wreck. The entry wound gaped like a mouth. But she counted her breaths. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Her vitals were falling and she knew it, but her hands remained steady enough to push medications, to adjust the colonel's foot drip, to do her job until someone physically removed her from the room. Dr. Sterling was already on his phone. She saw it in his face. The calculation. The moment he understood that Margaret had just saved the colonel's life, not in the way he'd imagined, not through his brilliant surgical intervention, but through muscle memory and field training and something deeper than competence. Through something he could never name because it wasn't taught in medical school. Sterling's jaw clenched. His free hand curled into a fist. He was a man watching control slip from his fingers like water. By the time she was wheeled into trauma surgery, her shoulder stabilized, her ribs wrapped, her blood pressure trending upward because she'd been trained to control her own bleeding before bleeding controlled her, Sterling was already dialing. Board members first. Then the director of nursing. Then hospital administration. The story he wove was elegant in its cruelty. A nurse with clearly unstable mental health. Performing unauthorized procedures. Acting outside her scope of practice. Taking a bullet meant to protect a patient, which suggested delusional thinking, hero complex, possible psychiatric episode requiring immediate evaluation. Was it safe to have someone like that on the floor? Could Sacred Heart really afford the liability? The word liability did most of the work. By 0800 hours, Margaret was suspended pending psychiatric evaluation. By 0900 hours, hospital security was escorting her from the building. They gave her a box for her locker contents. She carried it to her car in the parking garage. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Her shoulder throbbed. Her ribs sang with every breath. But her hands, still shaking, only from blood loss, not fear, placed each item in the box with precision. Her badge went in last. 2 days later, she sat in the waiting room of the VA hospital in Portsmouth. The seats were military-issue plastic, molded by thousands of bodies over decades. The air smelled like antiseptic and old coffee and the ghost of someone's cigarette from outside. Across from her sat a Marine with one arm. Next to him, a sailor with scars on his neck shaped like lightning. An Air Force tech with a walker. All of them waiting. All of them tired in the way people get tired when the world has taken something and will not give it back. Margaret clutched the box containing her combat boots. The mandatory psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for 1,100 hours. A formality, they said. Routine. But they said it the way people say things when they've already decided. The appointment was a courtesy, a documentation step before they finished what Sterling had started. She would fail the evaluation. There was no version of her mental health that would survive the narrative he'd constructed. A woman with untreated PTSD. A woman who'd walked away from the military. A woman who'd inserted herself into a situation that wasn't hers. A woman who'd taken a bullet and somehow made it about herself. The waiting room was so quiet she could hear the rain outside. It had started 3 hours ago. Not falling but attacking, vertical sheets of water that hammered the parking lot, the windows, the metal roof of the building like applause from an angry crowd. Margaret had been sitting in this chair for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of watching other veterans shuffle in and out. 40 minutes of avoiding the eyes of the woman at the desk who kept glancing at her the way people glance at problems they do not know how to solve. She opened the box. The boots were 16 years old. Broken in. Scarred. The leather was cracked across the toe from where a mortar had gone off too close, the explosion had knocked her back, and she'd run forward anyway, back toward the field hospital tent, back toward the Marines who needed something other than gravity and shock. The laces had been rewoven a dozen times. The soles were worn almost translucent where they met the earth of Fallujah. On the inside of the left boot, in faded letters, someone had written, Angel 6 to 147 days sober. She had no memory of writing it. She almost threw the boots away then. Almost stuffed them back in the box, walked it to the trash, and let the rain destroy them. Let the water soak through the leather and rust the eyelets and turn them into nothing. Because these boots meant something. These boots were proof. And proof was dangerous. Proof was why she was sitting in this waiting room. Proof was why she'd left the Navy in the first place, because the boots reminded her every day of what she'd lost. Or what she'd given. She could never decide which. The rain was so loud it sounded like static. Like her mind on the worst nights. Like helicopters coming in for extraction. She held the boots for 10 minutes without moving. 10 minutes of rain. 10 minutes of veterans pretending not to notice her. 10 minutes of knowing that in 50 minutes, a psychiatrist would ask her about the incident at Sacred Heart, and she would tell the truth, that she'd heard the colonel's monitors flatline, that she'd known exactly where the pericardiocentesis needle needed to go, that her hands had moved like they weren't attached to her body anymore, like they belonged to someone else, someone younger, someone who'd held lives together in the dark. And that truth would be documented as evidence of delusional thinking. Proof that she was unstable. Confirmation that Sterling had been right all along. She set the boots back in the box. But she did not throw them away. And then she heard it. The sound started distant. A low percussion underneath the rain. Then closer. The distinctive percussion of rotor blades cutting through water-heavy air. One helicopter. Then a second. Then a third. They were not landing at the VA hospital, they were approaching. Coming in hot, the way military helicopters approach when time matters more than safety, when the moment they touch ground is measured in seconds that someone is counting down. 3 Black Hawk helicopters. Margaret's hands went still. The rain outside seemed to pause. The waiting room did not actually go silent. The clock on the wall still ticked, the fluorescent lights still hummed, someone's phone still buzzed in their pocket, but the silence was complete anyway. That specific silence that comes when the world is about to reorganize itself. The rotor wash shook the windows. The rotor wash shook the windows. 6 Marines in dress uniform pushed through the double doors of the VA hospital waiting room, their boots striking the tile in perfect synchronized rhythm. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The room went dead silent. Every veteran sitting in those plastic chairs, the ones with 1,000-yard stares and missing limbs and tremors they couldn't control, stood at attention without being told. It was muscle memory. It was respect. It was the kind of response that only happens when you recognize something sacred walking into the room. The lead Marine, a gunnery sergeant with a jawline that could cut glass, called out a name with the kind of volume that moved air. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. Margaret's hands went still. The worn combat boots, the ones she'd carried in her locker for 16 years, the ones no one at Sacred Heart had ever seen, sat on her lap. The manila folder the VA had given her fell to the floor. 3 psychiatric evaluations. A mandatory wellness check. All of it scattered across linoleum. Her son David stepped forward. He was wearing dress blues, the kind that meant he'd been briefed, that he'd been part of this. His voice broke on the first word. Mom. Senior Chief Petty Officer. The colonel's awake. He told them everything. A woman in a hospital administrator's blazer stepped beside him, trembling slightly as she opened a Pentagon file, the kind with the gold eagle seal, the kind that made people speak carefully. She read from it, her voice barely steady. Naval Achievement Medal for Exceptional Leadership. Bronze Star for Tactical Coordination Under Fire. Purple Heart for Wound Sustained Protecting Personnel. Purple Heart Second Award. And the Silver Star for Medical Heroics in Fallujah, Anbar Province. Saving 47 Marines in a single 72-hour period with no support, no backup, no possibility of evacuation. Margaret didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then a man stepped forward from the back of the group. He was older, silver at the temples, shoulders that still carried the weight of command even though he was civilian now. A Navy SEAL commander. He looked directly at her, and his voice was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Margaret and I served together in 2004. I watched this woman hold a field hospital together for 6 days while we extracted civilians from a collapsed compound. 32 surgical procedures. Compound fractures. IED wounds. Hemorrhagic shock cases that should have been fatal. He paused. His eyes glistened. She did all of that with a broken hand. A fracture through the 3rd metacarpal bone. Never left her post. Never asked for relief. The Marine stood at ease but did not sit. Their presence was a statement in itself. That's when the doors to the administrator's office burst open and a 2-star general walked out, not hurried, not angry, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had spent 40 years commanding respect. His uniform carried stars that seemed to catch the fluorescent light like warnings. He looked at Margaret once, nodded with what might have been acknowledgement, and then turned to face the administrator. "Where is Dr. Marcus Sterling?" The administrator's face drained. "General, he's in his office down the hall. He doesn't know you're here. He was told this was a routine psychiatric evaluation for the patient. Bring him. Now." Security moved. Boots echoed down the corridor. 90 seconds later, Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway, still in his white coat, still carrying the posture of a man who'd never been questioned in his own domain. He took in the scene, the general, the Marines, the file, Margaret standing with her combat boots in one hand, and his face went the color of old bandages. "Dr. Sterling." The general's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "You are relieved of your position at Sacred Heart Medical Center, effective immediately. Your medical license is under federal review pending investigation into patient endangerment, falsification of medical records, and harassment of nursing staff. Security will escort you from the building. Your credentials are revoked as of this moment. General, there's been a misunderstanding. I was protecting patient safety. You were protecting your ego. The general stepped closer. Behind him, a CNN camera crew was already filming, already capturing every frame. Colonel Hendricks was stabilized by Senior Chief Petty Officer Walsh using emergency pericardiocentesis when your clinical assessment failed. You then initiated a fraudulent psychiatric investigation against her to cover your medical error. That constitutes assault on a decorated military officer's medical provider and is grounds for criminal referral. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. His hand shook. He reached for the wall to steady himself, and his fingers scraped against the paint. His voice came out as a whisper. I was just doing my job. I was following protocol. You were retaliating against a superior medical mind because she challenged you. The general nodded to security. Take him. Handcuffs clicked. The sound of metal on metal in a public waiting room filled with witnesses, nurses who'd started their shifts, staff members who'd heard the commotion, veterans who were watching a reckoning unfold in real time. Sterling's white coat was removed. His badge was cut from his scrubs. He was escorted past the gathered crowd, past every person he'd humiliated, past the woman he'd tried to destroy, and his face crumpled like paper as they walked him toward the exit. Margaret later learned that Dr. Marcus Sterling, cardiac surgeon and department tyrant, was hired 6 months later at Norfolk Community College to teach CPR certification courses. The name tag read Steve. He made $14 an hour and flinched every time someone called him doctor. He taught basic life support to teenagers and community college students who had no idea they were learning from a man who'd once commanded trauma bays. His students complained that he corrected their hand placement obsessively and sweated through his polo shirt during demonstrations. But in that moment, Margaret stood in the waiting room with her blood-stained cardigan. The bullet had passed through her shoulder, the blood had dried into the fabric, and her son wrapped his arms around her. His shoulders shook. He whispered words she couldn't hear into her hair. The Marine saluted, a gesture of respect to respect, and the SEAL commander placed a hand on her uninjured shoulder. "Welcome home, Senior Chief," he said. She held the combat boots in one hand. With the other, she reached up and squeezed her son's hand. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 16 years of restraint releasing itself in a moment when she didn't have to be quiet anymore. When she didn't have to be just a nurse. When the world finally knew what her hands had held, what her training had accomplished, what her silence had cost. The general approached her directly. He was close enough that she could see the seams of his uniform, the perfect creases that came from decades of discipline. "Senior Chief Walsh, we have a standing offer. The Naval Medical Command would like to discuss your return to active duty. The 5th Medical Battalion needs a chief. They need your expertise. More importantly, they need your leadership." Margaret looked at her son. At the Marines. At the SEAL commander who'd flown across the country to stand beside her. At the waiting room full of veterans who were still standing at attention, as if her presence had elevated them all. She took one measured breath. "Sir, with respect. I'm not finished here." The general smiled, actually smiled, and nodded. "Sacred Heart is lucky. Dismissed, Senior Chief." As they left the building, Margaret pulled on her combat boots for the first time in 16 years. The leather was cracked and soft from storage. The soles were worn at the heel from 1,000 marches she'd thought she'd left behind. But they fit exactly the way she remembered. 3 days later, she was back in the ICU at Sacred Heart. Not as a floor nurse. Not as someone hiding her qualifications. The hospital board had announced sweeping reforms, a new trauma protocol, a mentorship program, a standing position for a chief nursing officer of trauma services. Margaret took the job in scrubs, and she walked the same corridors checking the same vital signs, but now the residents asked her questions instead of questioning her. Now the surgeons consulted her before making decisions. Now her hands were trusted the way they'd always deserved to be. The barista at the hospital coffee shop, a Marine Corps vet who worked evenings, started writing her name on the cup with a small anchor next to it. She almost smiled the first time she saw it. In moments of quiet, in the space between shifts, Margaret sometimes held the combat boots and remembered the field hospitals. She remembered the weight of decisions that meant someone lived or died. She remembered walking away because the weight had become unbearable. But she also knew now that the weight had only shifted. It had never truly left. The quiet had been the only way she could carry it. Until the world caught up. Until the world remembered who she was. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one standing quietly in scrubs, whose hands have held more lives together than most people will ever know. The question isn't whether Margaret made the right choice walking away. The question is whether you would have the courage to come back. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.